Please note that in this show, you might hear graphic descriptions or language that may not be appropriate for everyone. Listener discretion advised.
Art can be a verb. And I feel like that's really what art has become for me, because I can't have these conversations with the people that I have them with. I put it into my artwork, and it's like, I dare them to look at it, it's like, look at it. No one came to save me, right? Like growing up in this way, like, I don't know if people didn't know it was that bad, or like if they just didn't give a shit.
Welcome to Parentless Podcast. I am your host, Stephanie Relaford. On this show, we're going to be speaking with others who have experienced the loss of one or both of their parents or parental figures. As we heard in episode 12 with Louisa Velarde, being parentless is like an island, and I don't know how to swim. Thank you for being my life jacket.
Hi, I am Ashley Mcclure. I identify as an artist, teacher, mother, creative person. I'm currently a high school art teacher. I live with my husband and super feisty 3-year-old daughter in Massachusetts. So I teach during the day and then I make art at night. And yeah, that's I feel like that's me in a nutshell. I love teaching. I've been teaching for almost 10 years now. Prior to that, I was an illustrator, and I grew up in Rhode Island with my mom and dad. I'm an only child.
If you or someone you know is experiencing a suicidal crisis or emotional distress, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Why are we here? Who is your person?
So my person, it was funny. I was reading through your questions and I was thinking, it's so funny to call it my person. It's just because my person was my mother. She died in 2012. I was 24. She was 51. I feel like when you say my person, it kind of pulls at these strings, because she was my person when I was growing up. As a child, I was definitely a mommy's girl. Oh my God, I loved my mom. When I was about 10 years old, she got really sick. And so then I started to rely on other people as my people. And so when you say my person, I don't know, maybe that's why I'm just oof. It's kind of a gut punch. It's she hasn't been my person in such a long time. I think that's what's sad about it. I think it's important to preface why I was so interested in sharing my story, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
So when I saw your podcast, I felt like it was a really good place to kind of share my mother's story for a long time. And you'll understand once I sort of explain the history of my family. I've sort of felt invalidated in my own experience growing up with my mother. And then I also feel like her experience wasn't validated. And I think her death was partly a result of that. And I just feel like she never got a chance to tell her story. And her story is integral to how I was raised and how things ended up the way they did. And I don't think the types of things that happened just go away, right? So it's my story, but it's also part of now my daughter's story, right? It's going to be a part of her story. But if we're not allowed to talk about it, then things just fester. And for a long time, I've sort of been it feels like shouting into a void. I say that a lot, but it just feels like even if the people who really matter to me aren't listening, at least someone's listening and someone can hear. And maybe my mom, wherever she is, can feel at peace that I've kind of shared her story. So I'm going to start way back at kind of the beginning, and it's going to get heavy. And I don't really share this with many people because it makes people super uncomfortable. I've had very few people actually say to me, what happened with your mom? Before she died, throughout college, I always had a tumultuous relationship with her, and I'd make all this art about her and about growing up with her. And I went to art school. So everything at that point was about feelings. And no one, it was very rare for someone to say to me, like, what happened? What's the story? And so my mom, and she shared this with me when I was really young, like I might have been 10 or 11. She was in hypnotherapy or hypnosis therapy. And she discovered these memories kind of came back for her. And so I was around 10 or 11. And prior to 10 or 11, I like to say that my childhood was relatively normal. I think my mom struggled, but she was able to kind of keep it contained. Like, I think she was able to sort of have control over her demons and her mental illness. So, she was actually diagnosed with dissociative personality disorder, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, all that. And then it came out like when I was around 10 or 11 that she remembered being molested by her grandfather. And that's when things got really kind of bad. So, it was my mom and my dad and they were raising me. My mom was a graphic designer and art director. My dad, he was born with a developmental disability. When I was young, it wasn't so bad, but he suffered a great deal of head injuries. He had narcolepsy. And so he got into a number of car accidents, suffered head injuries. He fell off the roof when I was a kid. So anyway, the three of us kind of were a unit. And we lived next door to my grandparents, which was my mother's mother and father. I remember the day she came home from therapy and she said to my grandmother, it was him, it was him, it was him. And my grandmother shushed her. She said, shh, 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 and she didn't want to hear it. And my grandmother actually so it's funny because that moment I remember so vividly. From that moment on, my mother just started to disintegrate, right? My mother was funny. She was fierce. She was feisty. She was talented. She was a good mom. And then she just slowly over those next decade and a half kind of just like withered away, right? My family, like we stopped getting invited to holidays and stuff like that. I think years later, I had an uncle say, well, your mom was just a bummer, right? So we sort of became isolated, my mom and my dad and me. And so here I have this mentally ill mother, severely mentally ill. Like there were times when she disassociated and didn't remember who I was. She like quit her job as an art director, tried to be a freelance artist. That didn't work so well. My dad was a paper carrier. My grandparents who lived next door were, what do you call them? Oh, when old people go down south for the winter.
Snowbirds?
Snowbirds, thank you, yes. And so when my grandparents were around, things were great. My grandmother kind of took over. I would sleep over my grandmother's house like every night. She would take me places. Like she kind of really took over the parenting aspect. And then when she went away, when they went back down to Florida, things got bad. And sometimes I don't know if my family knows how bad it was because they kind of removed themselves from the equation. I don't know if they were ashamed or if they didn't believe her. But anyway, so my mom's family just kind of like disembarked from us as much as possible. Like sometimes there wasn't enough to eat and things like that. My mom was the one who was the take charge kind of person. And now that she was kind of, in bed all day and not really living, my father kind of had to take charge, and having the disability that he had, he wasn't really a full adult either. And so, when my grandparents weren't around, it was like I was on my own, right? And so like there wasn't always like, my parents weren't great with money or with like making sure there was enough food. And so I spent a lot of time at friends' houses in those winter months when my grandparents were around. And so this is just build up, right? This is just me growing up. So once I got to teenage years, I kind of, my mother and I were very close up until I was in middle school. And then, her illness kind of took over, and I kind of spent more time with other people's parents and with my grandparents. And then when I got to high school, I got a boyfriend, and I spent like all my time with his family. And so she and I grew apart, and that was really hard. And I think she took that really hard. She didn't really understand what happened. Like she didn't see that anything was wrong with us. I think she had this like delusional thought that like her being in bed all day was okay, So she stopped leaving the house, stopped going out. Sometimes would take too much medication. Like I said, there were times she'd forget who I was. And so when I had graduated and was working in the illustration field for a while, I basically moved out right when I got into art school. I didn't move back home after that. Art school was kind of like my ticket. I worked my butt off, and I got into RISD, and I went, and it was really fortunate that I went. And it's funny because like we were so poor that like RISD pretty much gave me a full ride. I only had to pay like a few $1,000s a year, which is miraculous, right? And so RISD was my escape. And so, I graduated RISD. I was working in the illustration industry, and I was 24, living with a couple friends in Providence. And then, then my mom died. And the way she died is, it came out later in the coroner's report that she had overdosed, and they deemed it a suicide. I don't know if you want me to get into like that day, but that's what happened. And I like to sort of, in my head, I don't think that would have happened the way it did if she had the support that she needed. I think her being mentally ill and mental illness in general is just like such a hard thing for someone you love to deal with. And even now I have such trouble kind of coping. Like my best friend is severely mentally ill in a lot of the same ways. And I find it really hard to kind of understand what she's going through. And it's even hard for me sometimes to be there for her. But I think my mother didn't have the support that she needed. And I sometimes like blame myself for what happened, but basically, she overdosed and she died, and that's what happened. It was very sudden. I talked to her a couple days before, and she seemed like she was in good spirits. Like we had, so a little more background. My mother actually built a house next door to her parents. So that's the house I grew up in. And so we moved there when I was like 2, and it was just like my mother's pride and joy. Like her goal was to like, this is when she was well, her goal was to build this house. And then when my grandparents got older, she was going to sort of take care of them. And that's sort of what her dream was. And then that all kind of like went to shit. Right. And so when I was in college, we lost the house. My mother and father couldn't pay the mortgage. So they moved into this little apartment, and it actually was really good for my mother. It kind of gave her this reset, and she loved this little apartment. And so she started like doing things that were sort of normal again. Like she kind of got back into like she used to love just cleaning. And I mean, that was part of her OCD originally, but I don't know, this little apartment kind of gave her like a reset. And so I had talked to her a couple of days before, and she seemed fine. And I went to visit her, and she seemed okay, right? She didn't seem suicidal. And I think people who are listening who probably have had the similar experience with people who commit suicide oftentimes don't see it coming because the person has a resolve, and then they feel at peace with it. And so then all of a sudden those terrible kind of symptoms or feelings seem to go away. And so they seem happy, right? But they're happy because they're about to die. Right. So, yeah. So it was unexpected. And so that's the background, and that's what happened. I've been making art about my mother since before she died. I think when I got to college, I started to make like really personal pieces of work about growing up with a mentally ill mother. And I didn't even at the time really understand what I was doing, what images I was using. And then even in those post-college years, I was making work. And then after she died, things sort of came into focus and became clear. And I just pulled shame out of the equation. I just started making images, sort of bearing my soul and bearing my story, because I felt like there's no reason to, not tell people what I, in my head, I feel like it killed her. Like she just like held on to this pain, and then like no one would listen. And so I try to tell her story with my art, but now I'm trying to tell my own. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different directions that we could go, but I think first of all, I want to kind of, we talked about her mental health. Was she seeing doctors for that?
Yeah. So my whole life, she was seeing this one therapist. She was seeing, a psychiatrist, and then also a therapist, like a counselor therapist. I recently actually reached out to her therapist because she had reached out to me after my mom died, and I just didn't have the sort of strength, or I just couldn't talk to her. She had been my mom's therapist for like 30 years, right? From like 20 to 50. And I finally called her. It had been 10 years since she'd reached out, because my mom died in 2012. So actually, no, she reached out. My brain is with, so what? So it's been about 9 years. So I called her. Wait, no, 9 years, right? I'm really bad I'm an art teacher, so I'm bad at math. So yes, it's been 9 years. So it's been 9 years. It'll be 9. It was 9 years in February. So I spoke with my mom's therapist.
When did you speak with her? When did you speak with her, in February or when?
No, I spoke with her like in July. I finally reached back out to her because I just had been making this series of drawings for a graduate class, and there was a lot of things I didn't know about my mother, didn't understand, a lot of questions I still had. And so I called her therapist and called to ask. And so in answer to your question, yes, she had a therapist, and I was able to kind of glean a lot more information about her disease from the therapist. It still leaves a lot of questions, but I was able to kind of understand a little bit better what was going on.
Wow. And so the therapist was able to share with you because your mom has passed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think, and that was something I was a little worried about too, but I think she didn't go into, like, she basically, the way it worked was she said, I know you have some questions. Why don't we start there? And you ask me some questions and I'll see what I can answer. And a lot of the questions were basically just like, I said, like, could I have done anything to save her? Which I know consciously that's not true, but she said, your mom was really, really sick. She said she was my toughest case. My mom really gave her like a run for her money because of all her, like, she even said, your mom had suffered such abuse that she developed multiple personalities, right? Like, so she had dissociative personality disorder, and like she had these, said I saw them manifest in therapy, and I was like, oh my God. And she was like, and she loved you so much, but she just didn't know like what to do with you. Like, she wanted to protect you, but she just like didn't know like really how to be a mother. And so, it kind of answered that question of like, like there's nothing I could have done to fix her, right? Like I could have done a million things, and like nothing I could have done would have fixed her. But so she was able to just answer kind of questions like that. I sort of speculated other things, and she was able to kind of answer those. So in answer to your question, I don't think she was violating any like HIPAA things. Like she didn't like read notes from sessions, or she didn't really tell me what my mother said, but she kind of was like, gave me some impressions of kind of what being with my mother for that long kind of gave her. Yeah.
I just wanted to touch on that because what an experience and an opportunity for you to be able to have. And so I was just going to go back. So you actually, you reached out to me way back in March. And so it's taken us a while to get connected and meet, but I was just interested kind of in that timeline because, you starting to reach out to me, being willing to share your story, and then you kind of taking that step to be willing and able to call the therapist and make that connection. So I don't know. I think that timeline is super interesting to me, and I'm very happy and glad that, I don't know if happy is the right word, but that you had that. So do you feel a sense of, I don't want to use the word closure. What do you feel after having that information?
Well, what's funny is I actually, when I was reaching out to her, I used the original email that I had and the original phone number, and they were both like disconnected. And so my worst fear, she's older, she's in her 70s now. So my worst fear, I was like, oh my God, I missed my opportunity to ask these questions. Like, she's dead. That's it. But I did some like online sleuthing, and I found her number. She moved to Georgia or something crazy. And so it's funny because in that moment when I thought I wouldn't be able to talk to her, I was like, this is the only, this is what I need to get this closure. And I haven't until this time been able to really like feel ready to talk to her. I think partly because of like, I've always kind of felt like it was my fault. And I didn't want her to blame me for what happened to my mother. And I know that's so irrational, but like as a kid with a parent who's got mental illness, you just like, you grow up feeling like it's your responsibility to like help them feel better, right? You want them to feel better. And like, so you just carry that with you forever, right? And so I was like, oh my God, I don't want this woman to think that like I'm an awful person, right? And so I couldn't talk to her for the longest time because I thought that she thought I was really awful. But talking to her really like, you know, I had a lot of questions about my mother's sexuality, just a lot of questions about like why she chose to marry my dad and like, you know, some other things that didn't really have to do with her suicide, but kind of helped me understand her. Because while she shared like a lot with me about her abuse, I know there are things that like she didn't tell me that she kept to herself, right? Like I'm convinced, and I can't speak for her, but I just know like, you know, I asked the therapist, I was like, do you think like there's just things that made me think that maybe she was like, I read these old diaries of hers, like she had diaries and diaries. And so that's been sort of helpful. I can't read those like too long or too frequently, but sometimes if I have questions, I can read them. I know that your question was, do I have closure? And so like, I'm getting there, I promise. But so, you know, for instance, I was like, I've been wondering, I'm like, was my mother, you know, bisexual or homosexual, right? Because she had these diaries of where she had like relationships with women in high school and middle school. And then she married my dad. And so I asked her therapist, I was like, was my mom actually gay? And like, do you think that was part of like her struggle? And she was like, you know, like, I can't say that. She's like, and nowadays everything is so, you know, she said for back then in the 80s and 90s, like things were not as kind of liberal as they are now. She said, do I think she would have been happier with a woman? Yes. She said, but I can't speak any more than that to it. And so things like that kind of gave me like some closure, and that like helped me to understand some of the things I observed growing up and some of the pieces I'm trying to put together about her. And so, yeah, it did offer some closure. And I think being able to talk about it is in that healing process of being able to feel closure.
This week's podcast spotlight features the On Purpose podcast with Jay Shetty. Usually I try to make this section grief related, but in reality, we are all dealing with more things than grief. And I don't say that lightly whatsoever, but when we get down to it, we all have so many moving parts in our lives, and there are many areas for us to work on. So I've been doing some self-reflecting lately, and I stumbled upon the On Purpose podcast with Jay Shetty. When I find a new podcast, I usually go right to the beginning and I start from there to see what I'm in for. Now, Jay has almost 300 episodes, and so I definitely played the lazy game and just clicked on the most recent episode. Friends, it was an amazing, amazing episode, and I just kept listening after that. Jay has a way of bringing up points that seem so simple yet so profound. He is able to shape his thoughts and ideas beautifully and communicates them brilliantly. Jay states that his purpose is to make wisdom go viral. He says that he's fortunate to have fascinating conversations with the most insightful people in the world. There are new episodes released every Monday and Friday. You can listen anywhere you get your podcasts. Please rate and review the podcast if you enjoy it. Live life today on purpose. Before I start asking questions, I think I'd like to ask, is there a place from here where you want to go? Is there any other parts of the story?
I mean, we could talk about the day that I'm sure people are, I know that when I'm listening to this podcast, I'm often wondering like, what happened?
Yeah.
Like,
So that's, I do. That is a question that I do try to ask because in my head, I remember those days.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people do. And that's something that maybe not a lot of people ask about. Mm-hmm. And so it does give a certain feeling to kind of share that day. So first of all, do you feel comfortable sharing your mom's name?
Yeah, yeah. Oh my God, I can't believe it. Her name was Carolyn.
Carolyn.
Carolyn. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When was she born and when did she pass away?
She was born in February 1st, 1961, and then died April 21st of 2012. It's funny because like we had just celebrated like her siblings, my uncles, had decided to have like a big birthday party and invite her to be part of it because she was turning 50. And I was like, oh, maybe this is like the start of some kind of reconnecting. Wouldn't that be nice? Right. Like my mom's family had always stayed connected with me, but there was an understanding that like, you're welcome to come, but please don't tell your mother. Right. Mm. So like once I got older and could drive, they started inviting me to, sort of back into their lives, which at the time I was just so excited to be back part of my big sort of family, aunts and uncles. And I know my mom was super hard to be around. Like I understand that. Like I lived with her. I know how hard it was, but sort of missing those holidays and those like cookouts and things, that was huge. Like that was just a huge missing piece for me. And then I think for her especially. But she had just celebrated her 50th birthday, like the year before with all of our family. So I was like, oh, this is like start in a new direction. And so then she had turned 51 and then April, she passed. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that day for you.
That day. Well, that week I actually had just been laid off from my job.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, which is, it was Wednesday, right? And I was actually kind of advocating for, like, my boss at the time wasn't going to give me my unused vacation time. And so, like, there was all this, like, heated debate about it. And my now father-in-law, but then when my husband was my boyfriend, he had said to my husband, he said, she's really hot-headed. Are you sure that she's the one you want to be with? And then like 2 days later, my mother kills herself. Right. And so I'm like, oh, great. Like they think I'm just like totally like a great fit. But so I was actually driving to their house to babysit their new puppy for the weekend because they were going away. My father calls me, and my mother and father would call me like, and I'm not, no word of a lie, like 12, 15 times a day, leave messages. My mom would leave messages like one after the other, and they would change mood because she was not well, right? So one message would be very angry. She would call me names. Next message would be like, I'm so sorry, I love you, things like that. So in college, I sort of got used to just ignoring. So my dad had called a couple times that morning, and I was just like, ignore. Finally, I picked up. I was on the highway. I was like, what's the matter? And he was totally, my dad, because he's got a developmental disability, like just blurts things out and is kind of childlike sometimes. The head injuries kind of exacerbated that, but he just blurted out, mommy's dead. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, she's not dead. Because in my head, instantly, I was like, he's just like, she's probably like just took too much medicine. She's asleep. Like that has happened before. Like she has taken too much medicine. We couldn't wake her up. But eventually she kind of like, we had to rouse her and then she would wake up. Or, there were so many instances where she like kind of would be in these psychotic states where she wouldn't be herself. And so I was like, she's not dead, Dad. Like, come on. Like, she's not dead. He's like, she's not breathing. She's dead. And so my uncle, which is like serendipitous, had been walking because my whole family, my dad's side of the family, who I have neglected to mention, has been awesome and wonderful. They always invited us for holidays, but that's an aside. My uncle was walking. He doesn't drive. They all lived, my mother and father's new apartment was like kind of in that same, they were in Pawtucket. So my uncle was walking from a store or something. And I don't even know how, but then for some reason, my uncle was there. And he got on the phone and he was like, Ash, you got to get here. It's really bad. And I was like, okay. Right. And so I kind of, I lost it because my uncle kind of said, my uncle was like, the paramedics are here. They're doing all they can, but I think your mom is gone. And I was like, what do you mean? And that just hit me I was driving on the highway and I started shaking. So I pulled into a gas station, and I still remember the gas station. Like, I will not get gas there. I remember just like, it was just such a physical reaction, because like when someone dies, that's it. Like there's no more anything. Like in your head, you're always like, yeah, like you put things off, right? Like I had always thought like we would reconcile, right? Like things weren't great for us. Like we were fine. But we weren't as close, so that was it. And so then I called my in-laws, and I told them what was happening. I was like, I can't come babysit the puppy. I think my mom has died. So I was like 5 minutes from their house at that point. So they came and picked me up from the gas station and drove me back to North Providence, where my mom and dad lived, right on the border of North Providence and Pawtucket. And we got there, and I've never actually walked through this in a really long time. I haven't walked through this in a really long time. My husband, by the way, was away on a business trip. He was my boyfriend then, but he was like in Alabama at some conference. And so like I couldn't get in touch with him. But so I remember his mom is a nurse, and, the paramedics came out, and my other uncle had come over at that point. My dad has 2 brothers. And so they were there with him. My dad was beside himself. I don't think he had accepted it or understood what was happening, but she was in the living room, and it was a tiny little apartment. And they said, your mother's in there. Why don't you go in and see her? And, I went in, and my mother-in-law, I asked her if she would go in with me, and she did. And my mother was like sitting on the couch with a t-shirt and underwear on. And it was clear that like her underwear was like put on. And the paramedics told me that my dad had said that he like found her naked in the living room. And so I remember like she was dressed, but I didn't touch her, because I remember when my grandmother died. And now you remember my grandmother was like the one who kind of ended up raising me when my mom got sick. So like I touched her after she died, and like I will never get that sort of feeling out of my head. And so I had remembered I like had hugged her like my mother a few days before this happened. And so I was like, I don't want to touch her, because I know that that's what's going to stick with me. So I didn't touch her. And I feel bad now that I like didn't kiss her or hug her or say goodbye, but she had been dead for a few hours at that point. And so I just knew like she was going to be like cold and hard. And that would have been, I think, really hard to sort of process. And so I remember sitting down next to her, and I said, "Oh, Mommy, what happened? Like, what happened?" Like, I said, "What did you do? Like, what is this?" And there were all these pills just like on the coffee table. She was on like so many pills. Like in addition to all her mental illnesses, she had rheumatoid arthritis and osteoporosis, fibromyalgia. And, I'm not gonna lie, I think her doctors like overprescribed, so she just had like all this medicine. And she left, there was a note kind of scrawled on like this scrap piece of paper. And the paramedic gave it to me. And it was an super angry note. It was like, it said something like, "This is my departure. Now your Auntie Charlene can be your mother." Like my Aunt Charlene was my dad's sister, who I kind of grew close with, high school and college. And my mother was always really jealous of our relationship. And so she said, "Well, now she can be your mother. This is my departure." She's like, now, it just was like a very sort of cold-hearted kind of letter. It didn't leave any reassurances, right? And, I totally understood. I consciously knew that like she wasn't well, but that was really hard. And then, I tried to call everybody, before I did that, I left and they had to remove the body, but my father wouldn't let them. And so I had to hold him back. I had to pull him outside, and I hugged him, and he kept trying to get away from me, but I had to hold him so they could take her away. And I remember one of the paramedics being someone I went to high school with. And I was like, and I was never like popular or anything. And I just remember being like, oh, Jesus, and like, who the fuck cares, right? Like, I don't talk to those people anymore, but I just remember being like, oh, like, great. Like, here's my mother's like naked body. Like, this guy I went to high school with. It was just a day full of just like, oh, I had never felt so panicked or embarrassed, but, and sad and angry all at the same time. It was just like all these emotions. And so my dad, being who he is, couldn't really process what was happening. And so like, and none of my family, I lived with, at that time when she died, I lived with my cousin. We had been roommates for a couple years. I brought my dad back with me there to stay for the week or so. And then like my mom's siblings came back with me and helped me like plan the funeral and stuff. So they kind of took, which was really nice. Her brother and like my two uncles and my aunts kind of took charge with the funeral home, which was really great. They helped me pay for it, which was really great, right? Like that was support that I needed and I'm super grateful for. But so yeah, that day I remember when everyone was in my apartment, it was like a tiny apartment I shared with my cousin. I went and I like lied in the bathtub, like I couldn't get this like heavy panicked feeling to leave because I had always kind of taken care of my parents from an early age, but they were codependent on one another in a way that meant I didn't have to like, because on their own, they were kind of like at that point, not super independent. Like my mother physically kind of couldn't get around, but she would do like the bills and she could read and write and stuff. So she would handle the bills, not well, but she did the bills and all that. My dad can't read and write, but he, was the one who would go out and get groceries and that kind of thing and take her to her appointments. And so now my mom died. I was like, oh my God, like I have to take care of my dad. And that was just like, I was 24. I was like, I just got laid off from this job. And now I should take care of my dad who like mentally, like, if you have a conversation with him, he's a really sweet guy, very slow. He wasn't always like that. I was exacerbated by head injuries and everything, but it's like, oh my God, like, what am I going to do? I was like, am I going to have to move in with my dad? Like all these, just my life upended. Right. And so that was the day. And then, that week I just tried, I remember the Olympics were on that week. The Summer Olympics had started. It might not have been that exact week, but I remember like being on unemployment, planning my mother's funeral, and just like the Today Show covering the Olympics was like the only thing that got me through the day. Like the only thing that like I like helped me survive was like filling my day with shit to do, because like I was laid off and I was like looking for jobs, but like I just felt panic all the time. Like it was a panic unlike anything I'd ever felt.
Well, your world's just been ripped from you.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was quite a week. It was quite a few weeks. We got my dad settled. I had to, my family made it clear, both sides, that I was in charge of my dad. They were like, it's on you. That's you. And so it was kind of fortunate that I was unemployed, because I spent a lot of time, like I went to all these assisted living places, trying to get a place for my dad. Ended up getting him a great place in a subsidized living facility, just the right kind of place, like where he can be independent, but if there's an issue, there's like a button he can push, and then their neighbor, who was really my parents' only friend at the time, she like lived upstairs from them. She kind of became my dad's companion after that. Like she just would spend time with him to keep him company. And then now they've been dating since those first few months. And she was a great help. She kind of came in and was like an angel, like she spent time with him when I couldn't. And I think he found a lot of solace in that. And so she was able to bring some normalcy back, and that like I felt like I could still have a life, and that he could still have a life. yeah, I got his affairs sort of settled. He and my mom had a lot of bills that they like hadn't paid. They loved getting furniture from this place called Rent-A-Center, where like, so like I had all these just like overdue like medical bills and things like that. And so then I had to get his Social Security all figured out. And like, so that took some time, but I did it. And it was miraculous. But I think if you have to do something, you do it. And then it, you know, like when you don't have a choice, it's what you do. So it'll be 10 years this February. And maybe that's why I reached out to you. Cause I don't know. Cause it's like coming upon the 10 years that it's been 10 years, but it still feels like it just happened in a way, you know?
Yeah. I always say that, and I don't know how many episodes you've listened to, but
I loved the grief dream episode. I listened to that one recently.
Oh, have you had any grief dreams?
Yes. Yes.
Tell me.
Yes. Well, I saw that and I was like, oh, hot damn. Like that's, yeah. So it's funny that, I forget his name, but the man you interviewed from Canada,
Joshua Black.
He was talking about how his dad, he was like rummaging through his stuff or something. And I was like, you know, it's funny how like the dreams that I've had about my mother are so mundane, but they give me comfort. So there was one, like the week she died, where I was driving, she was sitting next to me and I was like, Mom, what are you doing here? And she was like, where are we going? And I was like, I'm going to your funeral. And I don't remember what she said, but I remember saying like, I miss you so much. I love you. Like, I wish you would come back. And I might've said like, why? And then I woke up and like, it was, so like he was like, oh, I woke up from my dream and it was so comforting. And I was like, well, I haven't had any fucking dreams like that. Like, I'm not comforted. I just like, I have more questions. Like I have so many dreams where like, she's alive and like, I'm trying to talk to her and she can't hear me. And then like I have the opposite. And I don't know if he would still call those grief dreams, but they're dreams where I'm like, I wake up and I realize that she's dead all over again. And I'm like, it's like, it just like you think they're alive for like a second and then you're like, oh, wait, actually my brain just made up this reality that is not actually happening. So yeah, sorry. You were.
Oh, no.
I brought up grief dreams.
That's really interesting. And I think, you know, not everybody has these dreams and some people do, but I think, you know, you're allowing yourself maybe to kind of have those and to dive in, I guess, to feeling that loss all over again, unfortunately.
Yeah.
After those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't had one in a while, thankfully. And I find that when I'm really busy, I don't have them. I think because I don't remember my dreams as much because I'm sleeping less and I'm just sleeping through the night and then I'm waking up, you know.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please consider sharing the show with a friend or rating and reviewing wherever you're listening right now. This will help get the word out about the show, and if one person can be helped by listening to someone's story here, that is amazing. If you would like to share your story with me, you can visit the website at www.backhomemedia.com/parentlesspodcast. You can also email me at parentlesspodcast@gmail.com. Another way to get a hold of me is to find me on Instagram or Facebook, also at Parentless Podcast. And lastly, if you're a phone person, please leave me a voicemail at 623-396-6069. If you love the show and you'd like to help with any special projects that might go on at Parentless Podcast or just be privy to some special extras, go ahead and visit patreon.com/parentlesspodcast. Is there anything that just reminds you of your mom if you see, smell, hear anything?
Oh my God, there's so many things. It's funny because there's a lot of bad things I think that are kind of associated with like trauma, like post-traumatic. And I don't think that's what you're talking about.
It could be either way.
I think I'm reminded of her every day. So many things. some expressions that my daughter makes look just like hers. You know, when she's aggravated or mad, she does this little thing, and I'm like, oh no, it looks just like. I call my mom Angel Grammy for her. We call her Angel Grammy. So sometimes she looks like her, and she reminds me of her. It's hard because there's like this dichotomy. Like I have these memories that I'm sharing with my daughter that are really nice, right? Like the other night, I found this old tooth fairy pillow that I had, and I was telling my daughter, like, oh, whenever mommy lost a tooth when she was a kid, Angel Grammy would put the tooth in here. And then when I woke up, there'd be a treat from the tooth fairy. And I try to tell her stories about Angel Grammy all the time. But then there's like these other, I don't want to call them memories. They're just like they're kind of like these like sort of guttural flashbacks of like I'll smell like a particular cigarette. My mother would chain smoke. She smoked like around the clock. I kept some of her, some of the art and the paintings from our old house. And they're in this closet upstairs. And every time I open the closet, it smells just like my house did growing up. And I didn't really realize, you don't realize what something smells like until you're like away from it. But our house just reeked of cigarette smoke, like reeked. And so that smell a lot of smells bring me back. She would smoke these like Virginia Slims. And so it's like a menthol specific smell. But then also like I can smell cigarette smoke from a mile away, but I can also smell cat pee because our house was just filled with cat pee. Because my mom was like obsessed. Like we had like, I can't even tell you how many, we had like 5 to 8 cats at one time, always. And then like other miscellaneous animals like dogs and birds and lizards, guinea pigs, hamsters. Those types of things always come up for me, and I don't share those with my daughter. Like someday when she's like an adult, probably. But those kinds of things bring me back all the time. But I find that now that I'm a mother, more good things are coming up because this particular stage was really good. Like when I was really little, like I remember Play-Doh, like with my mother, like we had these Sesame Street play mats and we would play with Play-Doh. And like my daughter loves playing with Play-Doh. I've been making art out of Play-Doh. But so like, I think because having my daughter at this age has been great because like I'm remembering all these nice things about my mother, whereas before a lot of it was negative. So yeah, those kinds of things remind me.
Have you ever had any thoughts about like once your daughter gets to like 10 and 11?
Yeah, that's a tough, I've thought about that. I think in terms of being a mother, I feel like I really learned how to be a mother. I really think about sort of how my grandmother was, but then how my mother was when I was little. And then like, it's funny, I don't know what most people do. Like if most people, when they're like mothering their own children, think to their mother mostly. Like, I don't know if people do that because for me, it's like a myriad of people. Like in my head, like I have like books that I've read and then I think about like how my aunt did this or my grandmother did this or like my best friend's mother did this. And all those things kind of like influence decisions. And so I wonder if when Mattina, my daughter's name is Mattina, it's morning in Italian. I wonder if when I get to that point, if I'll have to sort of push away any sort of like, because now sometimes I'll be doing something and I'll think about how my mother, like for instance, I remember she would make these like Lipton rice for me because I loved it, like the chicken and rice, Lipton rice. And I remember I was being an ass. I was like 4, 5. And I was like, Mommy, I'm hungry. Like, come on. Like I was like rushing her making the rice. And she was like, okay, but it's not going to be ready yet. And I was like, I don't even care. Like I was being a brat. And so she gave it to me half cooked so that I could see like it's chewy and you have to give it time. And so like things like that are kind of like, so things like that, you might adopt, right? Like, well, see, if I don't cook it all the way, like it's not tasty, is it? Right. I think when she gets to 10 or 11, like, it's going to take, I'm going to have to sort of recall those other motherly figures in my life a lot more. And it's going to be hard because they weren't actually my mother, right? I mean, I already often feel kind of like I'm doing this blindly, but I think when it gets to that point, And maybe like, you know, I'd like to imagine that like Martina will also help guide me. Like what she needs will become clear to me. And I won't need to think about what my mother would do or what she would say. I can kind of trust my gut a little bit more. I'm hoping. She's only 3 right now. And slowly, I'm starting to trust my gut a little bit more, but we'll see. We'll see.
What age were you when your grandma passed away?
I was 20. I was a junior in college. So my papa passed away in 2007. And then my grandmother, my nanny, I called her nanny, passed away in 2008. Very natural because she, you know, kidney failure. She had diabetes. I'm actually kind of like, she was on hospice and she had called me. And I asked her if she was scared. And she said, what did she say? I'm not afraid to meet the Lord, but I will be sad to leave you. We always said that, like, I would always say, you're my favorite person. And she would say, you're mine. You know, we were very close. I would see her like every day. We were very close. And what's funny is that, you know, this podcast, it's like, it's funny because like she was such a huge positive influence for me. And she was like a mom. And here I am talking about my mother, who just like has been such a different kind of presence for me, like good and bad. But like, it's interesting to me to think about the sort of relationship my mother had with her mom. Like my nanny and my mom had like kind of my mother like yearned for her approval and her affection and her love. And my grandmother, from my sort of understanding, was kind of like, she had 4 kids. She was kind of like standoffish. I don't know. I feel like with me, she was very different. And part of me feels like that was her kind of like having a do-over in a way, like, cause she like taught me so much. And I remember when she went into hospice, she was living in Florida because we lost our house. So they lived in Florida at that point. They stayed in that house that they owned. And my uncle, my mom's brother, decided to fly us all down there, and we got to say goodbye, which was really nice. My mom was really strong during that whole thing. My mom loved my grandmother. Like, oh my God, she's just like, she, I think, really took that loss really hard. When I was little, I remember my mom being like, I don't know what I'll do when Nanny dies. Like, I don't know what I'll do. Like, it's not going to be, you know, cause she just like, she built a house next door to my grandparents, you know? So she took that really hard. Like I took it hard, but I don't know. I was able to sort of consciously understand like it was her time. My mother did not take it well. But yeah, so I was 21. No, what did I say? 2008. So it was right before I turned 21 that she died, my grandmother. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've had a lot of things piled on top of each other, kind of over the years, and one of the things that there's a lot of things that I think we haven't gotten to yet.
Right.
But are there any tips and tricks that you've learned, any coping mechanisms that have helped you, or anything that you've really just learned so far?
Well, I really think, and this has kind of been I think I never really thought of art as a coping mechanism because it was always just like something I did. And I had professors in college who would say things like, well, this is really cathartic for you. And I hated that idea of like art being a therapy, right? But it is. So like, especially when you're kind of making art that expresses a feeling or an emotion or a story, right? So like I always say, like, my art is my story. I make the art and it's cathartic because like a lot of times I feel like no one is listening, or like the people that matter aren't listening, right? Like I don't talk about my mom with my family. It makes them uncomfortable. My dad's family is great. Like they're really down to earth. They're fine. My mom's family though, like I think it's hard for me because like they haven't really validated that experience. And like no one has ever, it's funny. So my point is art is how I cope, right? Art is how I cope, but it's also how I like speak and scream. And like, I can't speak to these people, this family. I can't speak to my family because when I've tried, they think I like, it's like, you should be over it by now. Or like, why are we still talking about it? You know what I mean? So like making this art is not just a way to like I'm doing a doodle and I'm just meditating. It can be angry and it can be visceral and it can be, art can be a verb. And I feel like that's really what art has become for me, because I can't have these conversations with the people that I have them with. I put it into my artwork, and it's like, I dare them to look at it, you know, like, it's like, look at it, understand, like no one came to save me, right? Like growing up in this way, like, I don't know if people didn't know it was that bad, or like if they just didn't give a shit, right? Like my dad's side of the family did all they could. Like my mom, my aunt, I would sleep over their house a bunch, right? I think, like, I don't know, like sometimes people just, it's like no one has acknowledged, like, wow, like you grew up in like neglect, right? And like we see that, and we're so sorry that we like didn't do more to help you, right? And I think art has been huge. Like, I think it's more than just when we're coping. It's never just that one thing, right? Like people die and you're dealing with the grief. But there's so much more a lot of times that like comes with these feelings, right? Feelings of just like, in my case, it's just feelings of just like frustration. Like I'm mad that my mother killed herself. I felt like, I still feel like it was avoidable. That might not necessarily be true, but I like to think that if she had the support she needed, things would have went differently, right? My daughter would have a grandmother she could meet. So my art is a way that I cope. It's how I like visually just get it all out there. Yeah.
Okay. So I have one comment. I may or may not leave it in, but then after that, I want you to tell us how we can reach you. So this whole time that you were talking about your mom's family, what's running through my mind, and the fact that they don't want to talk to you about this, is the fact that whenever you said that your mom told your grandma about what had happened to her, she said, shh. Yeah. So I feel like that's like an overall blanketing maybe of like how things were treated within the family.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I love that you're using your art. You said, I dare them to look at it. So maybe one day, they've seen it. And I do think, like, let me just say this, like, so growing up, like my mom's oldest brother and his wife, my aunt and uncle, they would invite me to sleep over. And, I've been able to sort of cultivate relationships with my little cousins, and I'm really grateful for that. But as my mother's siblings, like, I feel like they could have done more, right? Like, sure, invite me over for sleepovers once in a while, but why don't you come and visit and sit with your sister? Definitely, I think like that kind of mentality, that sort of like, we don't talk about it, is something that was perpetuated by my grandparents and kind of just carries on. It's funny because my aunt recently passed away during right before COVID, and we had a little wake for her, not a wake, but like a little service. And it's funny because like we ended up having a conversation about my great grandfather, my mother's abuser, and it's like no one we bring it up, but it's like this elephant in the, and it's strange to me because I'm like, do they know that the elephant's here? Have they forgotten about that elephant? Right. And so like they've seen my art. And since I started posting, I post my art. And since they've seen it, I actually started so many years ago. I think this drove a bigger wedge between me and them. I started a fundraiser with RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. Like anyone can start a fundraiser with them. So I started this fundraiser, and I wrote this whole thing. Like I wrote this whole story on there. And I was like, I'm raising $2,161 in honor of my mother. This is her story. And in the story, it said like people who loved her shunned her. Like she was shunned. And like, they know, I think they know that I feel this way. And it's hard because it's like, do I approach them with it? Like, it's something I talk to my therapist with all the time. And he's like, would it make anything better? And I'm like, I don't know. Right. But I was talking to my uncle that day of the service for my aunt. We were sitting down to have a meal. And we were talking about my great grandfather. And he was like, you know that he died. He said something like, he died from a broken neck.
you know that, right? And I was like, no. He's like, he got into a car accident and he broke his neck. He was driving at like 90, like he was 90 years old or something. He was driving and he hit something. He broke his neck. And he said, it was a long and painful death. And I was like, oh. He was like, and so that felt like a moment. I was like, does he know like that I feel like, you know what I mean? Like, did he want to tell me that so that I would sort of feel better about like this person who abused my mother, right? Like, I don't know. So I sort of took that and I was like, well, that's nice to know. Like, it's nice to know that this man, because my mother never told me how he died, and maybe she did and I don't remember. But in that moment, I was like, maybe is that his way of sort of acknowledging that abuse, right? Like,
if you could, and if you want to use your grandma here or your mom here, however you want to do that, if you could talk to them and just tell them anything now, what would you say to them?
I'm sure you get everyone pausing here. This is a tough one. I don't know. I think with my nanny, it's easier. I think it's less about talking and more about like, I just would love to hug them again. You know, I would love for my mom to meet my daughter. I would love to tell my mom about my daughter. I think that's what I would love to do. My mom was always very excited about the idea of a grandchild because she talked about me as a baby all the time. She was like, when you have kids, you know, she's missing it. She's like missing everything. So yeah, I think it'd probably be about my daughter. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you have a therapist. So
I do.
You go regularly then?
I do, like once a month. After she had died, I was going like, I had just started. It's funny because I didn't have great luck with therapists. That week my mom died, I tried to call some of the ones I had at RISD. There was a couple counselors that went off on their own. And they were like, sorry, I'm not taking any patients. I was like, at this moment of desperation, I was like, what the fuck? Like, can you just like talk to me? And my friend at the time, her sister was a counselor, a licensed social worker, and she recommended this gentleman. And I've been seeing him ever since. I was seeing him twice a week. And like I can't say enough about him. He's technically a licensed social worker, but he works with me on coping and kind of like cognitive sort of therapy where my brain often goes, because I was raised in a dysfunctional way, right? And so like a lot of times I react in a dysfunctional way. So like I often turn things inward, think things are my fault when they're not, or I'm trying to fix situations that don't require my attention, right? So he just works with me. You know, we don't really do a lot of people imagine like talk therapy where you're just on a couch and talking. Like, I don't really do this with him. Like I don't think I've really talked to him about my story since I started with him. And I imagine that's on purpose because he wants me to look forward. So yeah, that's been like an integral part of my healing for sure.
Mm-hmm. If you would like to answer or not, you may or may not. Do you have any mental illnesses that you deal with?
That's a great question. Of course I do. Right. So I have anxiety and depression, mild. I've been on an antidepressant since I was 16. I do think that if I was taken to a therapist instead of psychiatrist at 16, maybe a lot of my issues could have been resolved with strategies instead of medicine. I'm on a low dose of something. I find that when I try to get off of that, my body kind of goes haywire. So I'm on it kind of to just stay like at the status quo. But yeah, and a lot of those issues kind of stem from those like attachment issues that I have, you know, the sort of dysfunction of my mother kind of just shutting down. Like she was no longer there, right? Like she was a mom, and then one day she just like left the building, you know. That's kind of how it felt. And then she wasn't there. Her body was there, but she wasn't really there. And so that's like something, and people don't realize it when and I have such a mild, like I wouldn't anxiety and depression is mental illness, but like, you know, what people don't realize about it is it's like so much of it for me is like rooted in these experiences, you know? So these experiences kind of determine how I manage my day-to-day life. And so I have to learn to kind of rewrite and rewire my brain kind of throughout the day. So like the work that my therapist does with me is to, well, how do I sort of, instead of doing like what I inherently want to do isn't always correct, right? And I want to say correct, but functional, right? Like, so the way that I perceive things. And so it's a lot of work.
Can you tell us like how we can reach you, or how we can see your art, and if you have Instagram, or how you want people to reach out if they would like to?
People can always reach out over Instagram. It's Ashley.Mcclure, dot as in like a period. So Ashley period Maclure on Instagram. I have my website has my artwork, but my email is also there. People can always email me. Yeah, I found healing in art as well, because one thing that I hadn't experienced with the stuff about my mom was like, I had made these pieces just about another experience. I had miscarriage, and I made these pieces about that. And those really seem to resonate with people, because like, it seems like just in general, like there's so much that people don't talk about, right? Like miscarriages and like these sort of hush hush things. And nowadays I think people are getting kind of more bold and better about speaking out, because I think older generations are just kind of like, well, you young people, if you're going to talk about it, I'm just going to shut my ears. And then we talk about it anyway, whatever. So what brought me a lot of healing was that other people came forward and they were like, I had this experience too. So that was really cool. And that happened on Instagram. And so that's been like really great. So I love to hear like, oh my God, if anyone has any similar experiences or grew up with a mentally ill parent, like I like to hope that my art can sort of help them visualize kind of maybe things that they can't otherwise visualize themselves, right? Like maybe you can verbally talk about it, but you can't like visualize it. Some people can relate to it.
Yeah, of course, as soon as I saw that you had a website, I went to go check it out. And I think that your art is amazing, and the
Thanks,
images are, you're welcome, man. The images are just strong. They are strong, like not like you know what I mean? Not like
I know, I got you. I know what you mean. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, bold, definitely bold art. And
well, I actually made, like last summer, not this summer, but last summer, I had this professor that was like, you should paint from memory, just from the memory of what happened with your, like, you know, I was making these pieces about my mother, and he was like, just paint from memory. And I got so mad. I was like, fine, I'll just paint because I was just like so frustrated with the feedback he gave me. So I literally painted the scene of my mother's dead body. And so like that, and just doing that was like, it was like a switch went off in my head. And I was like, and so I did like half a dozen more. And it just like, oh my God, like just I wasn't worried about what it looked like. I just kind of like made it. And it was so freeing, you know, just to be like, just get it on paper. And so thank you. I appreciate you saying that. I just put them on there because I did them. And so I'm glad when people kind of like them and or enjoy looking at them. That's always nice.
So what's your website?
Oh, it's just ashleymcclure.com. MAC.
MACLURE.
Yeah, I kept my maiden name. Started out as a lazy thing because changing your name is really time consuming and difficult. And then my husband's like, this isn't actually the reason you didn't change your name. But I started getting all feminist about it. I was like, why do I have to change my name? Like, it's my name. Like everyone, this is my name. I'm an artist. This is my name. Why do I? So now it's like partly like, now it's been like, we've been married 9 years. No, sorry, 8 years. 8 years. We got married in 2013. So I haven't done it yet. And part of it is I'm just like, why do it now? So Maclure, Mac. My students call me Ms. Mac.
Ooh, that's cool. So it's really Maclure?
Maclure. I mean, I don't say it's Mcclure, but if you pronounce it that way, people will spell it MC. So I'm like, right. My name is Miss Maclure. So they get it, you know?
Ashley, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Steph. It's been great. Bye.
Parentless Podcast is recorded in Phoenix, Arizona. Find us on social media and most major podcast platforms. Music provided by Colin Lococo and the Revolving Birds. Studio and editing provided by Back Home Media and Ian Relaford. Check out one of the many shows on our network. I am your host, Stephanie Relaford.